Welcome, traveler. Tonight our path leads downward, beneath the churches, beneath the marble and the prayers, into a place where faith no longer saves but binds. This is not a tale of saints. It is the story of men who believed they had been called to guard hell itself. They called themselves the Night Pilgrims. Their vow was simple, to keep the darkness from escaping the world. And if you listen closely, even now, among the hills of central Italy, you may still hear it, the sound of a bell that rings beneath the earth. They say it happened on a winter's night in 1178, when the ground split like a wound near the village of Norcia. The sky had been clear, the stars cold as hammered steel. Then the mountain groaned, a sound that seemed less like thunder and more like something alive, something vast, turning in its sleep. When the tremor stopped, a hill had vanished. In its place yawned a black gorge that swallowed the moonlight whole. The villagers crossed themselves and whispered that the devil had turned in his grave. But it was not the pit that frightened them. It was the sound. From deep within the earth, muffled by stone and centuries, a bell was ringing. Not a church bell. This one was slower, heavier, almost human in rhythm, as if tolling for the living instead of the dead. It rang through the night, through the next day, and into the next. For 3 days and 3 nights it sounded without pause, echoing across the valley like a heartbeat too stubborn to stop. The villagers prayed, then fled, but a few men climbed toward the sound. They were not priests, not soldiers. They were wanderers, hermits, penitents, men who had once sought God and found instead their own reflections staring back from the abyss. One of them was Brother Athanasius, a monk who had left the Benedictines after confessing that he no longer feared hell, only silence. Another was Ivo, a mason who had killed his brother during a famine and now carried the cross he had carved for the grave on his back. The rest were nameless, or rather, they had chosen to forget their names. Together, they followed the sound through fog and ash until they found a fissure in the earth, steaming faintly like the breath of some buried giant. And there, in that darkness, they knelt. They did not know what waited below. They did not ask. They only listened to the bell and to what it made them feel, a strange peace like recognition. 3 days later, they built a small chapel beside the gorge. No altar, no icons, only a door that led nowhere but down. Upon its lintel, they carved a single phrase in Latin, Custodes Tenebrarum, the keepers of the darkness. It was not meant as pride, it was confession. Years passed. The chapel grew into a monastery, its stones blackened by smoke and time. Pilgrims began to arrive, drawn by stories of men who prayed in silence and never saw the sun. The church sent envoys, curious and suspicious. What kind of faith hides itself underground? What kind of monk guards hell instead of heaven? But the Night Pilgrims had no doctrine to defend. Their words, when they spoke at all, were simple. God made light. We tend the shadow. And when the envoys pressed further, they found only the echo of the bell, deep below, tolling still, as if the earth itself was remembering something too heavy to forget. If you walk there today, traveler, through the ruins above Norcia, you can still find the stones of that chapel, black with centuries of rain. Stand long enough and you may hear it too, faint, patient, deliberate. A bell that never stopped ringing, a vow that was never broken, and the whisper that begins every pilgrimage. To guard hell, you must first find it. The church never recorded their founding, only their disappearance. In the margins of a forgotten parchment from Monte Cassino, a monk had scrawled one cryptic line. They came from the storm and prayed where no one should pray. That was how most legends of the Night Pilgrims began. Not with miracles, but with omissions. They were not born as an order. They gathered the way shadows gather, slowly in silence, drawn toward a single wound in the world. Some were monks expelled for blasphemy, others soldiers broken by the Crusades, their faith bleeding out through memories they could not forget. A few were simply wanderers, pilgrims without destination, who followed rumors of the bell that rang beneath the earth. Their names are lost, but their confessions remain, etched into the walls of what was once their monastery. You can still read fragments on the stone if you stand close enough, if you dare to touch the soot. I am he who watched a city burn and thanked God for the smoke. I sought heaven and found a mirror. We keep vigil that others may sleep. For them, the world had already fallen. The wars of faith, the torture chambers of heretics, the screams that rose behind the doors of holy men, all of it convinced them that hell was not beneath, but within. And so, they reasoned, if mankind had built its own abyss, someone must guard the gate. They built their monastery with stones taken from abandoned churches, nothing consecrated, nothing blessed. Their chapel faced no direction, for they believed that salvation had no compass. The only light permitted inside was what filtered through the cracks in the wall, and they covered even that with cloth. They prayed in complete darkness, whispering the Psalms by memory, their voices blending until they became indistinguishable from the wind. Each brother took an oath of oblivion, to renounce not only his past, but his future. They shaved their heads not as a sign of humility, but as an offering to anonymity. They wore black robes without insignia, so that when one died, another could wear it, and the order would remain unchanged. Their days were short and measured only by hunger. Their nights were endless. At dusk, they gathered in the refectory, where no lamps burned. They ate bread that tasted of smoke, drank water drawn from the fissure they called il respiro, the breath, and listened for the bell. If it rang, they knelt. If it did not, they listened harder. They believed that the sound was not a warning, but a heartbeat, the pulse of something divine trapped beneath the earth. Some called it the devil's tomb, others God's forgotten heart. None could agree, but all agreed that if the bell ever stopped, the world would fall silent with it. The first abbot, known only as Father Severin, wrote that the brothers were not men of faith, but men of witness. He believed their purpose was not to save souls, but to endure their echo. We pray, he wrote, for the damned who cannot pray for themselves. We take their watch that the world may rest. And in the sound of the bell, we hear not their torment, but their persistence. Even hell, it seems, refuses to end. In time, people began to call them the Night Pilgrims, for they were seen only after dusk, moving through the forests with lamps of iron, their chants rising like a second wind. Peasants left food at the edge of the woods and avoided looking directly at them. Those who claimed to have met their gaze said the brothers' eyes reflected no light, as if their pupils had learned to swallow it whole. Once a traveler asked Father Severin how one becomes a pilgrim of the night. He replied, by losing the way to morning. And so they continued season after season, unseen, unrecorded. While kings fought and popes crowned themselves, the Night Pilgrims kept their vigil over the darkness no one else dared to touch. For centuries, their bell continued to ring, sometimes faintly, sometimes not at all, reminding those who listened that salvation and damnation were not opposites, but neighbors divided by a door only the brave would guard. If you stand there now, among the ruins swallowed by moss and shadow, you might still hear a low hum underfoot, a sound that feels more like breath than metal. Some say it is the earth settling, others say it is memory. But the locals, the ones who still cross themselves at dusk, they whisper another explanation. The pilgrims never left. They simply went deeper. They called the fissure il respiro, the breath, because it exhaled in seasons. In winter, a warm current rose from it, sweet with minerals and rot. In summer, the air drew inward, as if the earth were drinking. Standing at its lip felt like standing near a sleeping animal and trying not to wake it. The approach began at dusk, no torches until the last turn. The brothers walked single file, hands on the shoulder of the man before them, counting the steps aloud in a whisper that became a prayer. Gravel slid, leather scraped rock, cloth brushed damp stone. When the path narrowed, they pressed their palms to the wall and felt for the familiar veins in the limestone, the ridges they had named by touch: ladder, rib, harp. To an outsider, it was chaos. To them, it was a psalter carved by rain. At the mouth of the cave, they stopped and waited for the bell. It was never loud. It was there, a weight on the air more than a sound, as if the chest of the mountain rose and fell and the stone itself remembered rhythm. When it settled into them, they began. No light at first. Darkness was their first discipline. A man who cannot keep company with the dark, Father Severin had written, is not yet ready to guard what lives there. They learned the floor by knees and knuckles, the roof by bruised scalps, the narrowings by breath that changed shape to pass through. A slow crawl, a short climb, a cold squeeze that taught patience to ribs. Behind them, the outside world thinned to a rumour of wind. Only at the first chamber did they allow the iron lamps. Each burned a wick soaked in oil that stank of sheep and sea. The flames were low and stubborn, throwing a light that behaved like water, rippling over rock, breaking on stalagmites, pooling in the black glass of subterranean pools. On the floor lay the marks of generations. Knees worn into hollows, palms polished into mirrors. The cave had been their teacher longer than any abbot. Here the ritual began. They unbound their eyes with ash-black cloths and stood facing the deepest passage. No icon, no cross. The wall itself was their altar, mineral and indifferent. They sang the night psalm, a fragment stitched from verses they could not entirely remember. Out of the deep I call, even if the deep is me. If you count sins, who could stand? If you count breaths, let me be counted among them. A novice carried the stone bell, not a bell at all, but a hollowed stalactite whose heart had been bored out by centuries of water. Suspended from a rope of braided hair and hemp, it answered touch with a tone too low to name. They did not strike it. They stroked it with an oiled hand until it spoke. The sound did not fill the chamber so much as thicken it, as if time had gained weight. One by one, the brothers confessed without words, not to a priest, but to the cave. The rule was simple. The body tells the truth, the mouth cannot. A shoulder pressed longer against the stone meant anger, not yet forgiven. A hand that hovered over the black pool and could not touch the surface meant fear of death pretending to be humility. A man who could not kneel had a debt to a father. A man who could not rise had a debt to himself. The cave received it all with the same expression, which is to say, none. Then came the questions. They were always the same, asked by the abbot and answered by silence. If hell is below, why does it breathe? If the devil is a person, why does he sound like a bell? If God is light, why did he make so much dark? The answers were behaviors, not words. A brother who stepped forward at the first question would spend the next month above ground, chopping wood, learning the grammar of daylight again. Another who trembled at the second would sleep near the entrance and teach the novices to hear the difference between wind and memory. The one who smiled at the third had to go back to the refectory and eat with both hands, slowly, until the smile learned to mean hunger and not pride. Deeper passages waited, throat, lung, mouth, names that turned anatomy into map. In lung, the air gathered in a bowl of stone and moved as if alive. Sit long enough, and your breath learned its rhythm. Panic slowed. Grief discovered it had a pace, and, having found it, could be walked beside. In mouth, a seam in the wall fluttered with a draught that tasted metallic, like an old key. Some swore they heard voices there, not words exactly, but the shapes of words. Father Severin forbade listening for that. Your mind will write people into the wind, he warned. You will call them demons because you fear your own handwriting. The deepest place had no name. The brothers approached it only once a year, on the night the earth felt most awake, a date decided not by calendar, but by the way the animals behaved. They left offerings that were not really offerings: loaf, water, salt, the first page of a novice's psalter, not burned, not torn, simply left. Then they lay flat in the dark, cheek to stone, and vowed the vow again. We keep this watch so others may sleep. We bind our eyes so others may see. We guard what we fear, so fear may have fewer doors. No one descended farther. It was not prohibition, it was respect, the boundary between witness and trespass. Hell, Father Severin wrote, is not a pit. It is a task, and tasks become hellish when we mistake them for destinies. Sometimes a man broke, not from terror, but from recognition. In the echo of the bell, he heard his own name, the way a child hears it from a far room, urgent, tender, implicated. He would stand too quickly, hitting his head on the low ceiling, then laugh or weep, and the brothers would guide him to harp, where thin drips of water plucked stone into song. There he learned to breathe again, until his chest stopped arguing with itself. The cave did not reveal doctrine, it revealed limits. How long lungs can go without light, how far knees can travel before the body begins to translate pain into prayer, how warm guilt can make a cold rock feel. The Night Pilgrims took notes not in ink, but in habits. Fewer judgments, slower sentences, the refusal to say the word forever. And what did they believe waited in the dark below? Ask them on different days, and you would collect a catechism of contradictions. Athanasius would say, "It is the place where God keeps what he will not destroy and cannot yet forgive." Ivo, the mason, would say, "It is my brother's breath, and I will keep it from freezing." Father Severin, tired, would lift his hand to the stone bell and answer, "It is only us, seen from the inside." That was the scandal of their faith, not that they guarded the devil, but that they guarded humanity, its rage, its hunger, its unspent grief, trusting that to hold the door was holier than to pretend the house had only one room. When they finally turned back toward the surface, the lamps seemed brighter for a moment, and then simply ordinary. The wind at the mouth felt loud, vulgar with sky. They blinked against the stars and found them almost indecent, jewels worn too early in the day. At the chapel, they washed in cold water and said nothing. Silence was not rule anymore. It was relief. If you ever find il respiro, do not bring a torch. Bring your pulse and your patience. Press your palm to the rock until you feel the slow, impossible yes of stone answering skin. Then ask yourself the only question the Night Pilgrims ever truly cared about. What darkness am I willing to keep so that someone else can sleep? Evening was the only time the Night Pilgrims resembled monks. The rest of the day, they were shadows, moving without form or speech, tending to silence like a crop. But when the first wind came down from the mountains and the color drained from the world, they gathered, not for prayer as others knew it, for something older, rougher, the Black Vespers. The ritual began with the extinguishing of light. One by one, the brothers snuffed their lamps until only the breathing of men remained, slow, synchronized, reverent. Father Severin stood among them, unseen, and raised his hand. No words, no signal, only the weight of expectation passing from man to man. And then, as if by instinct, they began to hum. Not melody, not harmony, but the sound of a hive remembering it was once a storm. The hum became a low chant, non lumen, non somnus, non finis. No light, no sleep, no end. They chanted until the words lost meaning, until the body understood what the mind could not. That darkness was not the enemy, but the element in which truth survives. Each man kept a stone beside him, carved with a mark known only to him. During the chant, he held it in his palm. The weight reminded him of what still tied him to the earth, a sin, a regret, a name, a promise not yet broken. When the bell beneath the monastery answered, faint but deliberate, they placed the stones in a circle, the shape of a wound or a halo, depending on where you stood. No candles, no icons, only that ring of stone, warm with human touch. They knelt, not to worship but to listen. The abbot's voice came then, measured, weary, cutting through the hum like a blade through cloth. Brothers, what have we learned of the dark? And they answered together, their voices a single breath, that it does not end. Sometimes the ceremony lasted minutes, sometimes hours. No one decided when it should end. The bell did. When it fell silent, they would rise, wrap their hoods tighter, and return to their cells. There, each brother kept a single line carved into the wall, a record of what the dark had told him that night. Fragments survive, traced by archaeologists centuries later. Forgiveness is heavier than sin. Fear is love that forgot its name. God hides where the brave stop looking. They called these carvings the Psalms of Stone, a gospel written not to be read, but to be endured. The Black Vespers were more than ritual. They were survival. Life underground warped a man, the absence of sun, the constant echo, the slow erosion of sense and self. Some pilgrims went blind early, their eyes adapting to the dark, until light became pain. Others developed strange sensitivities. They could hear insects walking on the beams, smell storms before the wind arrived, sense lies as changes in temperature. They believed these were gifts from the abyss, small compensations for choosing the opposite of heaven. But not all gifts are gentle. There was one brother, Lucian, who could not bear the silence. He had been a priest once, exiled for preaching that hell was a place inside God himself. During one Vespertide, when the chant had reached its deepest tone, he began to laugh. Not a defiant laugh, more like the gasp of a man who has finally understood something terrible. He cried out, "Brothers, if we guard hell, who guards us?" No one answered. The bell rang once, sharply. Lucien fell silent. The next morning his cell was empty, his robe neatly folded on the threshold of the chapel. In its pocket was a small stone, smooth and black as glass. Some said it was from the lowest part of Il Respiro, a token from whatever waits below. Others said he had simply walked into the night and kept walking until the stars devoured him. After that, the abbot added a new verse to the Vespers. "Keep watch, even on yourselves." The villagers who lived near the monastery began to notice strange things. When storms gathered, no thunder came near their fields. Wolves avoided the forest at night. Crops grew even in lean years. They whispered that the monks had struck a bargain, that for every year of peace above, a soul below was kept awake. The peasants left offerings at the foot of the hill, bread, oil, a child's toy carved from bone. The brothers never touched them, but the gifts always vanished by morning. Rumor reached the church, as rumors always do, but the bishops were slow to act. A group of men who claimed to guard hell served a purpose after all. Better that the darkness be kept busy, even by heretics, than free to roam. And so, the Night Pilgrims were left alone, forgotten, tolerated, quietly feared. A monastery without sunlight, praying for a world that no longer remembered their names. When dawn returned, if dawn could still be called that in their part of the world, the brothers left their cells and walked the narrow corridors in silence. They did not speak of what they had heard in the dark, or what had whispered back. They merely touched the stone bell as they passed and bowed, each in his own rhythm, as if to thank the earth for keeping its secret one more day. In the archives of Monte Cassino, one line survives from Father Severin's final letter before his death. "The dark has taught me this, that to pray for light is to demand blindness. We will remain here, eyes open, until the world learns to see again." And so they did. While above them empires rose and fell like waves, the Night Pilgrims kept their watch, their chants dissolving into the rock, their souls woven into the hum of the bell, their faith reduced to a single impossible command: do not let the dark forget we are watching. It began with a tremor that was not the Earth's. Brother Athanasius, the one who feared silence more than hell, had carried his burden longer than the others. Nights of black vespers had thinned him into a cord. Every toll of the stone bell tightened it. He slept in snatches and woke with the taste of iron in his mouth, as if words he would not speak had rusted there. The cave soothed most men. It sharpened him. On the night it happened, winter had pressed its cold hand over the valley. The fissure Il Respiro exhaled warmth, like an animal in a burrow. The brothers descended in their slow procession, counting steps, palms against ladder, rib, harp. In the first chamber, the iron lamps breathed their low animal light. The bell answered a touch, and the air thickened into listening. Father Severin intoned the night psalm. The voices rose like fog. Athanasius did not sing. He had brought something forbidden. A small twist of oiled cloth, a flint, the seed of day smuggled into night. The rule against flame near the depths was not superstition. The caves held pockets of breath that would ignite if angered. The brothers called them angels without wings, invisible, holy to the touch, eager to make a sacrament of recklessness. But Athanasius told himself this was not recklessness, it was confession. If darkness was their discipline, let the dark hear the truth. When the chant thinned, he stepped away from the circle and knelt at lung, where the air gathered in a stone bowl. He drew the flint across steel, once, twice. A shy blue tongue appeared, astonished to be alive so far from morning. He cupped it in the oiled cloth and fed it breath. "Brother," whispered Ivo, tasting heat before he saw it. "No." Athanasius did not look up. His voice was steady, the steadiness of a man whose decision has erased its alternatives. "I will say what the mouth refuses." He held the flame near the stone and began. Not a prayer, not a psalm, but a catalogue. The kind of naming that turns the world into a ledger. He named the child he had not saved in the siege at Zara. He named the woman who had washed his feet and whom he had driven away with doctrine sharpened into a blade. He named the night he begged God for thunder and received only a fly walking across his lip. He named his pride at enduring more terror than the men beside him. He named his envy of the bell, which could be heard and never answer. With each name the flame leaned, the air trembled, as if breath itself were an instrument reluctantly tuned. The brothers shifted, hands seeking stone, the old animal in them waking and pacing. Father Severin stepped forward, palms open, voice gentle as bread. "Athanasius, come back to the circle." "Master," Athanasius said, "I have stood in the dark until the dark wore my face. I have guarded a door so long I can no longer tell which side I am on. If hell needs a keeper, perhaps it is because we keep making keys." The flame flared. A soft boom answered from within the rock, a hollow cough as a pocket gave up its invisibility and married the spark. The chamber bowed. Light ran across the ceiling like water poured too fast. Lamps flickered as if startled. Somewhere deeper, the cave exhaled with a sound like a tired animal rolling in its sleep. "Down!" hissed Ivo. Bodies flattened, robes became tar, faces pressed to stone that had learned men's shapes over generations. Fire skimmed the ceiling, a sheet so thin it could have been a thought, and passed, leaving the smell of singed hair and a lace of soot, fine as handwriting. Silence. Then the bell. Not the stone bell the brothers touched, but the older one, the one the earth owns, answered. Not louder, clearer. Its note carried a contour they had never heard, a second voice inside the first, like sorrow remembering its birth. Athanasius wept, not from fear, from recognition. "It speaks," he whispered. "It has always spoken. We have been too obedient to hear." Father Severin crawled to him, knees and palms grinding grit into prayer. He took the coal from Athanasius's hand and pinched it closed. The dark returned with relief, a friend allowed back into his own house. "You have confessed, son," he said. "Now atone." "How?" "Listen without answers." They lay there a long time, Bel stitching the dark into courage, breath after breath relearning the oldest pattern. When at last they rose, the soot had written them into the rock like shadows that had not yet decided to detach. Back in the first chamber, the brothers formed the ring of stones with shaking hands. Father Severin added a new question to the night's catechism. If the flame tells the truth, why does it burn the tongue that speaks it? No one answered. Perhaps that was the answer. The penance began at once. Athanasius was forbidden the depth for 40 nights. No cave, no bell, no black vespers. He was sent into daylight to split wood until the grain taught him patience, and to carry water until weight taught him mercy. The villagers watched him pass, hood back, eyes red, face older by a decade the night had carved in an hour. Children followed at a distance the way children follow storms that do not know their names. In the evenings when the brothers gathered, he sat outside the chapel, back against the cold wall, and kept a separate watch, one man's vespers, thin and stubborn. Sometimes the bell's note found him anyway, burrowing through stone, entering the chest not as sound, but as balance. He learned the humility of hearing from far away. On the 20th night he carved his confession into the cell wall, each letter slow, as if the blade were learning the alphabet again. Fire is a tongue that cannot keep a secret. I asked it to. Forgive me. He left the rest for the stone, but the cave had not finished speaking. In the days after the flame, the air shifted in Il Respiro. Warmth rose where cold had lived, a draught turned, like a sleeper choosing a new dream. The stone bell required less touch to answer. And once, only once, the earth bell below offered 2 notes at once, a broken chord so human it made Ivo sit down hard and laugh out loud. The brothers argued without words. Some believed the fire had sinned against the rule, and the cave rebuked them for pride. Others believed the cave had approved, and the flame had burned away the deafness that had grown like lichen over years of discipline. Father Severin allowed both thoughts to sit at his table. He called them twins and told the novices to learn to feed contradictions without teaching them to bite. That winter, a traveler came seeking shelter, a Dominican with road on his sandals and questions in his pack. He listened as the villagers told him of a bell that rang under stone and a brother who had tried to light the dark. He narrowed his eyes the way men narrow them at heresy, and he smiled the way men smile at opportunity. His name was Matteo, but the Night Pilgrims did not yet know the sound it would make in their story. On the 40th night of Athanasius's penance, the abbot brought him to the mouth of the cave. No lamps, no ash-bind, only the smell of limestone and the low, patient breathing of the earth. "Speak," Father Severin said. Athanasius bowed his head and spoke the shortest prayer he knew. "Keep me useful." They entered the first chamber together. The lamps kindled. The men formed the circle. The bell answered the touch with a note clean as winter. Father Severin placed the stone bell rope in Athanasius's hands. "Confess again," he said, in the old language. Athanasius stroked the bell with oiled palm. The note rose, then settled, then opened like a door in a house that had more rooms than anyone remembered. He did not ask for fire. He had learned what the dark meant when it said enough. And deep below, from that room without a name, the earth gave back a sound as close to forgiveness as stone can make. Once each year, when animals turned restless and the wind changed taste, the Night Pilgrims chose a night with no moon, not by calendar, but by moods of weather, stone, and men. The bell beneath the monastery would sound different then, its note wearing a slight edge, like metal cooled too quickly. That was their summons. Preparation took a day of silence. No black vespers, no chant. They ate in the courtyard, under a sky emptied of ornament, each man with a heel of bread and a pinch of salt. The rules for the pilgrimage were short and unforgiving. No one descends alone. No speech past the first chamber. Bring nothing you are unwilling to leave behind. Turn back at the first lie your breath tells you. They tied themselves with a lifeline, a rope plaited from hemp and human hair, blackened with smoke, soft with the memory of palms. Ivo checked each knot twice. A novice always walked second, so that courage felt a hand ahead and a hand behind. The oldest brother walked last, listening for a change in tension that meant panic had begun to speak. The first chamber accepted them without ceremony. Lamps lit, hoods lowered, eyes closed, then opened. Father Severin placed the stone bell in its sling and laid a hand upon it, the only blessing the order allowed itself. Then they bound their eyes with ash-black cloths and entered the passage they called throat. The descent was a choreography the body remembered better than the mind. Heel-toe, hand flat, knee bend, breath soft, silence steady. Rocks gave up their names under touch, ladder rung by rung, rib with its comforting curve, harp singing in thin drips. Beyond these, the cave widened into lung, where the air gathered and breathed in bowls of stone. Here they rested, palms to rock, letting their chests learn the mountain's rhythm. Heartbeats, which had argued, began to agree. They left their first offerings there. A loaf split into 7, salt in a folded leaf, and a page torn from a novice's psalter. Not burned, not defaced, simply given back to the element that chews paper into time. Father Severin insisted the page bear a line the boy loved, not a line he feared. "We do not feed the dark with terror," he had written. "We feed it with memory." Beyond lung lay the place called mouth, not because it devoured men, though it could, but because a seam in the wall spoke. Not words, shapes of words. Drafts curled from the fissure with a metallic taste, like an old key turned by a hand you could not see. The rule forbade listening, but men listen with their bones. They paused, and in the pressure of air against skin, each found what he had brought. Grief pressing like a thumb, anger pricking like cold, pride trying to stand taller than the ceiling allowed. They bowed to it without kneeling. There is a difference. Then the lifeline shortened. The passage narrowed into the channel no one named. Their knees slid, their shoulders learned humility one bruise at a time. The lamps were carried at hip height, so the flame would not lick the ceiling and turn breath into sacrament. Once, a pocket of invisible angels stirred. Heat brushed their scalps like a reprimand and passed. Athanasius squeezed the rope twice, the signal for "I am here," and felt 2 squeezes answer. So are we. At last, the ground leveled. The air felt older. This was the room without a name. Here they unbound their eyes. Darkness remained, absolute and complete. Even men who had forgotten sunlight felt small then, with the particular smallness that is not humiliation, but proportion. Father Severin's voice arrived as breath rather than sound. "Lay it down." Each man placed something on the stone before him, tokens small enough to carry, heavy enough to cost. A mother's ring, a scrap of a banner from a siege best left unnamed, a knife blunted to uselessness, a letter never sent. Athanasius set a knot of cord tied long ago around a wrist he could no longer picture. Ivo laid the wooden cross he had carved for his brother's grave and had carried for years like a sentence. The novice, trembling, set down a flaw he had kept secret. A pebble he had stolen from the monastery wall because its shine pleased him. Father Severin put down nothing at all. Later, someone would find his palm pressed to the rock, as if the hand itself were the only offering he had left. They lay on the stone then, cheek, chest, knee, so the earth could register their weight. No chant, no psalm, only the slow arithmetic of bodies becoming part of a sum. In that silence, a question rose the way heat does, not asked, not answered, simply present. When the bell below spoke, it did not ring. It moved. The note slid a fraction, as if the earth had shifted its posture. No one breathed for a heartbeat, and then all did together. Fear came, honest and ordinary, and was given a place to sit. The abbot's voice, barely voice, arrived from the dark. Speak nothing, promise nothing, listen. What they heard was not prophecy, it was scale, the mind measuring itself against what would not fit inside it. And because the mind failed, the heart took over and did what hearts do when they meet the uncountable. It kept time, breath by breath, beat by beat, not mastering the dark, not solving it, merely refusing to leave it alone. After a while, measured only by knees that began to ache, Father Severin lifted his hand. They rose. The novice wobbled. Ivo steadied him with 2 fingers. Athanasius found the rope and took his place near the front. He felt smaller, relieved to be so. They left what they had brought, no taking back. The offerings would remain until damp and salt, and time translated them into geology, a ring becoming stain, a page becoming pulp, a knife becoming patience. The cross, if any object in the world could survive down there, would last longest, wood remembering the tree. The return was always harder. Men want to keep what darkness gives, and it cannot be kept. In mouth, someone's breath lied, speeding to say danger when the only danger was making tomorrow pay for tonight's holiness. The rope saved him, a small tug of reason traveling from hand to hand. In Lung, another man began to weep without sadness, a clean overflow like spring thaw. He tried to apologize. Athanasius tapped his wrist twice. No penance for water. At harp, the thin notes plucked by drips rewrote panic into patience. Light from the first chamber arrived like gossip, too bright, too eager, not to be trusted fully. At the threshold, they rebounded their eyes before untying the rope. Only then did they light the lamps high and breathe like men who have been reacquainted with sky. In the chapel above, they washed in cold water with the deliberate gravity of those who know that purity is a temperature, not a virtue. The villagers felt it before they heard it. Dogs slept deeply. Babies failed to cry at the hour they usually did. The hill sat with a different weight, as if someone had moved a chair in the house, and the floorboards approved. The Night Pilgrims ate in silence, and then, as always after the pilgrimage, allowed themselves one question with words. "What changed?" a novice asked, voice cracking on the last consonant. "Not hell," Father Severin said. "Us." He dismissed them to their cells. Athanasius lingered in the doorway, nose full of limestone and smoke, the taste of iron finally gone. Ivo joined him, hands raw where the rope had argued with his skin. "Did you hear anything?" Ivo asked. "Yes," Athanasius said, "but it was mine." They did not name it. To name is to own, and nothing down there belongs to anyone. That night, the bell below offered once more that broken chord, 2 notes at once, human as grief. It carried up through the stone and into the hearts of men who had sworn to keep watch until watchfulness no longer required them. One of them, no one ever admitted who, added a new line to the Psalms of stone before sleep. Guarding hell is only guarding the door we built in ourselves. The work is not to hold it shut, but to sit beside it until it learns not to open. In the morning, footprints not their own marked the monastery path. Small, bare, a child's or a memory's. The villagers found bread on their thresholds, still warm. Someone spread the word that the monks had bargained with the dark again. The monks said nothing. They mended rope, oiled lamps, and waited for the next season when animals would grow restless and breath would change taste. Far down the road, a Dominican with dust on his hem asked a shepherd for directions to the place where a bell rings under stone. He thanked the man, did not cross himself, and kept walking. The pilgrimage had ended. Its echo had begun. They came at dawn, not with trumpets or threats, but with order. A pale procession of horses, cloaks stiff with frost, banners stitched with the black cross of the Holy Office. To the villagers watching from their fields, the men looked less like soldiers than like omens, their silence heavier than any sermon. At their head rode Father Matteo di Verona, a Dominican inquisitor known across the Italian valleys as the Whispering Fire. He was not cruel by nature, but he was convinced that mercy was a form of negligence. His sermons were quiet, his handwriting perfect, and his eyes, when they fixed upon a man, made that man speak even the things he did not know, he remembered. When he arrived at the foot of the hill where the monastery stood, he did not look up. He dismounted, knelt, and pressed a hand to the soil. It was warm. "Hell breathes here," he said. "I can feel its pulse." The villagers had warned him, though not directly. They told stories of men who lived without sunlight, who prayed for the dead but refused the Mass, who listened for a bell that no one else could hear. Matteo wrote the words superstitio subterranea, underground superstition, in his small black book, leaving a space for the number of heretics he expected to burn. But when he saw the monastery, he hesitated. It was smaller than legend suggested, a scatter of black stones clinging to the slope, no tower, no cross, just a single arched doorway swallowed by shadow. "Who built it?" he asked the nearest villager. "No one remembers," the man replied. "It has always been there." Inside, the monks awaited him without alarm. They had known he would come. Father Severin stood in the doorway, his hands clean, his eyes calm. Athanasius and Ivo waited behind him, hoods low, their faces unreadable in the grey light. Matteo stepped forward, flanked by two assistants. "By order of His Holiness and the Holy Inquisition," he said, "you are accused of harboring heresy and of worshipping in forbidden forms." Severin inclined his head. "We harbor no heresy, Father. Only memory." Matteo frowned. "Memory of what?" "Of what men fear to remember." The Inquisitor's fingers tightened around his rosary. "Then perhaps fear is wisdom." Severin smiled softly. "Fear is often the first step toward faith, but it is a poor place to stop." They led Matteo through the monastery. The cells were bare, stone, straw, water bowls, no icons, no crucifixes, no light. In the refectory, the brothers' bowls were arranged in a perfect circle around the table, as if each meal had been a prayer drawn in geometry. In the chapel, he found only a rope, a few black candles burned to stubs, and an inscription carved into the wall, "Custodes tenebrarum," the keepers of the darkness. "Do you claim to guard hell?" Matteo asked. "We guard what men cast away," Severin said. "If hell exists, it is made of what the righteous refuse to understand." The words lodged in the Inquisitor's chest like a splinter. "And the bell?" he asked. "The one that rings beneath the ground?" Severin's gaze did not waver. "It calls us to remember our work." Matteo stepped closer. "What is your work?" "To listen." The Inquisitor's assistants searched the cells and found nothing. No relics, no gold, no hidden texts. One brought back a small bowl of ash, still warm. Matteo studied it. "Whose ashes?" "Prayers," Severin replied. "You mock the church." "I speak in the only language the dark understands." The younger of Matteo's assistants crossed himself. The older spat on the floor. At dusk, Matteo demanded a demonstration of their so-called faith. He ordered them to pray as they always did, to prove that their devotion was not a mask for something unholy. The monks obeyed. They entered the chapel, extinguished all lamps, and began the Black Vespers. Matteo listened. The air changed. The chant was not words, but sound, deep, slow, woven of breath and stone. It made the hairs rise on his arms. He felt absurdly that the building itself was listening back. "Enough," he said. "Light the lamps." No one moved. "Light them." Still no movement, only the hum, low, endless, filling his skull until his own heartbeat began to lose its rhythm. He took a step backward, struck flint, and brought flame to life. The brothers flinched, not from fear but from pain, as if the light itself wounded them. And then, from deep beneath the earth, The bell answered, not softly as before, not hidden. This time it rang clear, a single tone, impossibly deep, shaking dust from the rafters. Matteo dropped the flint. His assistants froze. The monks did not move. They bowed. "Do you hear it?" Severin asked. The Inquisitor's face had gone pale. "What is that sound?" "It is confession." The bell rang again. The floor vibrated underfoot as though something vast had turned in its sleep. Matteo stepped back, crossing himself in trembling precision. "You conjure demons," he said. "No," Severin whispered. "We endure them." The ground shifted, a slow, groaning sigh that made the lamps flicker. One of the assistants cried out, thinking the mountain was collapsing. But the sound was not destruction. It was breathing. Matteo stumbled to the doorway and looked toward the valley. The air shimmered with heat, though night had already fallen. In the distance, animals fled their pens. He turned back to Severin. "You have cursed this place." The abbot shook his head. "We have only reminded it that it still lives." The Inquisitor raised his crucifix, its silver dull in the half-light. "By the authority of Rome, I order you to abandon this heresy." Severin looked past him, toward the altar, or where an altar should have been. His expression was not defiance, but pity. "Father," he said, "you cannot order the dark to leave its own house." By morning, Matteo had sealed the monastery. He left 2 guards at the path and wrote a report he did not send. That night, the bell rang again. The guards fled before dawn, saying the stones beneath their feet had whispered their names. When Matteo returned days later, the monastery was empty. The doors open, the rope cut, the black robes folded neatly on the chapel floor. Only one thing remained, a single line carved into the wall above the empty space where the bell had hung. The darkness keeps itself now. And though he burned the building to ash, the sound of that buried bell followed Father Matteo until the end of his days. Some nights, even in Rome, when he closed his eyes to pray, he heard it tolling, low, patient, inevitable, a heartbeat, a warning, a promise that hell once guarded never sleeps again. It began without warning, no cloud bank, no wind, no omen any priest would have understood. Just a shiver through the bones of the hill, as if someone had laid a cold hand on the back of the earth and whispered now. The villagers later said the moon looked too close that night, a pale coin pressed against the sky, but in truth it was the bell that called the moment into being. Not the monk's stone bell, the other one, the one buried deeper than memory. It rang a single note, pure, unadorned, and the monastery answered like a throat clearing before a final word. Father Severin had sent the novices away at dusk. He knew something had shifted when the air in Il Respiro changed taste, iron to salt, like blood becoming sea. "Go," he told them. "Walk to the olive grove and wait for dawn." 2 protested, 1 wept. All obeyed. Athanasius and Ivo remained, no argument in their faces, only the tired consent of men who have made their decision long before it is asked of them. They did not gather for Black Vespers. There was no time for liturgy. They walked the corridors once, touching the psalms of stone with their fingertips, nodding to the bowls and the rope and the doorway that had never led anywhere but down. Then they lifted the folded robes from the chapel floor, those left after Matteo's visit, and laid them out like bodies on a bier, a kindness for the living to find. The bell rang again. The rafters shook fine dust like old snow. Ivo steadied a lamp and laughed softly, the laugh of a man who sees something terrible and finally believes it. "It's close," he said. Severin met their eyes. "We keep the watch one last time." They bound themselves to the lifeline, 3 knots only, and entered the cave without covering their eyes. Light knifed the dark. The dark accepted the wound and did not bleed. At ladder, the steps seemed shorter, as if the rock itself were angling them downward. At rib, a flake of limestone sheared off and spun, a pale leaf falling in slow water. At harp, the drips had stopped. Silence there was a shape. In lung, the bowl of air was full to the brim. Athanasius pressed his cheek to the stone and felt it breathing like a sleeper with fever, too fast, then too slow, then catching itself in a thin human stutter. "Easy," he whispered, not to the mountain but to his own fear. Ivo placed the cross he had once laid in the room without a name back into his tunic. "For the road," he muttered. Severin said nothing. His face had the looseness of surrender. They went farther than the rule had ever allowed. Mouth exhaled a draught that tasted not of metal now, but of ash, fresh ash, the sort that clings to tongue and word. The passage beyond narrowed into the channel the brothers never named. The earth shuddered. A seam split with a sound like fabric torn in a church. They reached the room without a name as the bell tolled a third time. No lamps here, not from doctrine, but because flame lost its courage in that depth and guttered like a story reconsidering itself. Darkness closed their eyes for them. The floor tilted, decided against it, steadied, like a decision bending around mercy. "Lay it down," Severin said, and they obeyed without knowing what they had brought. Athanasius opened his hands and felt nothing leave. Ivo took the cross out again and set it on the stone with a sigh that was almost a laugh. Severin placed his palm down, the old offering the last, and spoke into the rock. "Keep what we could not." The mountain answered with a long, slow groan. Not rage, not collapse. The sound a door makes when opened for the first time in centuries. Air rushed past them, toward the deeper dark. The bell's note rose a fraction, then settled into a low chord that felt like forgiveness, if forgiveness were heavier. "Back," Severin said. "Now!" They turned. The return that always cost little now asked everything. In mouth, the seam yawned and a wave of hot air slammed them to stone. The rope held. In lung, the world tilted again and stayed that way, as if the mountain had chosen a new spine. In the first chamber, the lamps had fallen and were burning themselves out on their sides, drawing black ovals on the floor like mouths. The bell below continued, patient, patient, patient. At the chapel threshold, the first true quake arrived. Vertical this time, not side to side. The monastery leapt an inch into the air and came down wrong, like a man surprised out of sleep and striking his head on the bedrail. A beam split with a sound like a violin becoming a scream. The wall that carried the line, Custodes Tenebrarum, cracked through the word Tenebrarum, as if to say, the darkness is no longer yours to keep. Athanasius dragged the folded robes toward the door, as if evacuation required dignity. Ivo gathered the bowls, stacked them and stopped, absurdly precise, aligning their rims like coins. Severin took the rope from its peg and looped it around the pillar twice, then tied a knot no shipman would fault. "Listen," he said. They fell silent. Beneath the quake, beneath the rattle of fallen stone and the hiss of cooling dust, the bell spoke. Not single strokes now, but a measured tolling, the rhythm of a man counting mercy on his fingers. 1, 2, 3, the intervals exact, the note unwavering. "Do you hear it?" Athanasius whispered. "Yes," Severin said. "It's telling us when." He pointed to the doorway. "When the note falls, we move. If it rises, we wait." They watched the dust shake in the lamplight, listened to timing the mind could not believe, and the body had already obeyed. The toll fell, they went, the toll rose. They set their backs against stone and let the ceiling sigh grit over their shoulders. The toll fell, they crossed the yard. The toll rose, they stopped before the arch, and it fell in a curtain of fragments like a sentence halted before blasphemy. The toll fell, they were at the path. Behind them, the chapel gave up its roof and lay down into itself, with a dignity that made Athanasius bite his lip until blood answered. Halfway down the slope, the hill buckled. A slit ran across the path and opened like a lazy mouth. The bell's note deepened, not warning, but command. Severin shoved Athanasius forward and turned, too late. The ground dropped a hand's breadth under his feet and did not return it. He caught the rope around his waist and smiled. Actually smiled. "Finish the watch," he said, and was gone into dust. Ivo lunged, and the rope snapped his hands like old bread. Athanasius sank to his knees, the posture of prayer arriving before the prayer could decide its words. The bell tolled again. The note did not rise or fall. It held, as if to say, "This is the shape of keeping." They stayed until the second quake passed and the hill learned its new posture. Then they stumbled down to the olive grove, where the novices huddled under leaves that had not yet admitted fear. Athanasius did not speak. He put his forehead to the ground and listened to the bell through soil. Ivo laid his ruined palms on the grass and laughed, because grief sometimes arrives wearing joy's face. The bell rang for 3 days and 3 nights. On the first day, the villagers did not work. They sat with their hands open on their knees and breathed when the bell allowed. Chickens slept. Dogs did not bark. A child's fever broke at noon without medicine. On the second, strangers came from the farther valleys, led by rumour. They stood on the roads and crossed themselves in the old way and said nothing at all. On the third, rain came without clouds, a fine salt mist that left no puddles and washed no dust, only the feeling of having been acknowledged. When the bell stopped, it did not end. It arrived, at a silence so complete the ears did not believe it. The kind of quiet that teaches, the kind that leaves the heart to count for itself again. The ruins cooled. The fissure at the hill S-crown closed enough to be inconvenient and not enough to be forgotten. The monastery lay under its own weight, like a story that has chosen its last line and is content to keep it. In the chapel, now a shallow tomb, the line above the empty space where the bell had hung remained legible beneath soot. The darkness keeps itself now. Father Matteo returned with men and tools and authority and found only stones that refused to be moved more than an inch, as if they had chosen each other. He ordered trenches. The ground filled them back in with a politeness that bordered on contempt. He raised a wooden cross at the site and watched it tilt over months until it pointed not to heaven, but toward the olive grove where the novices had waited. In time, the valley learned to speak of the night carefully, not as punishment, not as miracle, as settling, the way a house remembers the weight of its first winter. Athanasius and Ivo buried what names they could under a small cairn at the grove's edge. They said nothing. The novices grew into men who could pass for farmers, masons, merchants. Some left, some stayed. None returned to the cave. Not because fear forbade them, because the bell had taught them what watchfulness requires when the watch is ended, to keep the door by living beside it. Years later, shepherd boys climbing the slope would find bits of blackened rope and a bowl fused to a stone by heat that no fire in the valley could explain. They would carry them home, then carry them back the next day and set them on the path again without knowing why. The mothers would smile and say, "Leave the monks their dishes." The fathers would look up at the hill at dusk and touch their foreheads with 3 fingers, mind, heart, belly, the places where fear takes root. And on certain winter nights when the frost climbs the cypresses like a slow white fire, a traveler standing very still at the edge of the ruins will feel the ground hum under his boots, not sound, not tremor, something closer to consent. The Night Pilgrims did not fail. They finished. The bell does not ring now, but it is not silent. It has taught the earth to keep its own watch. Let the world around you fade, until all that remains is a soft hum beneath your breath, the echo of something old, something that remembers. Tonight I'll tell you a story almost lost to history, a story of silence, of faith, of men who believed that their purpose was not to find heaven, but to keep watch over hell itself. They were called the Night Pilgrims. It is said that long ago in the hills of Italy, a monastery stood on a place where the earth itself seemed to breathe. At dusk, You could feel it. A pulse underfoot, steady and patient, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. And from that mountain, on certain nights, came the sound of a bell. Not loud, not holy, but heavy, a tone that sank into the chest more than the ear. They called it the bell beneath the earth. No one knew who built the monastery. The villagers said it had always been there, a cluster of black stones clinging to the hill. But the men who lived inside were unlike any others. They spoke little, and when they prayed, it was not to ask for salvation, it was to listen. They believed that beneath them lay a gate to the underworld, a wound in the skin of creation, and they had sworn to guard it. They prayed without light, they ate without speaking, and once each year they descended into the darkness, a pilgrimage below, to lay their fears, their sins, and their memories before the breathing earth. It wasn't penance, it wasn't ritual, it was conversation. Deep beneath the rock, they said the air was warm, sweet with minerals and the faint taste of metal. The monks would move in single file, their hands on the shoulder ahead, their eyes covered with black cloth. They knew the path by touch, stones with names like ladder, rib, harp. And at the end of the descent, they reached a vast hollow space. They called it the room without a name. There they would lay small offerings, a ring, a letter never sent, a cross carved by trembling hands. Then they would lie flat on the ground and listen, to the breath of the mountain, to the heartbeat of the bell, to the silence that answers when faith runs out of words. They believed that hell was not below, but within, and that someone had to keep the watch, not to fight the darkness, but to remind it that it was still seen. For years they lived that way, quiet, unrecorded, forgotten by the church, but not by the earth, until one winter morning riders came. An inquisitor from Rome, pale and precise, arrived to test their faith. He demanded answers. Who do you serve? What God do you worship in the dark? The abbot only smiled and said, "We guard what men cast away. If hell exists, it is made of what the righteous refuse to understand." The inquisitor watched their midnight prayers. He saw them kneel in the blackness, chanting no words, only breath and tone. And then, beneath his feet, the bell began to ring, loud and alive, shaking dust from the rafters. He fled before dawn, and the next night, the mountain woke. The ground split open. The hill sighed and the monastery sank into itself. The bell rang 3 times, once for each vow they had ever taken, to guard, to listen, to remain. For 3 days and 3 nights the valley heard it, a sound that was not warning, not grief, but something gentler, as if the earth were whispering, "It's done." When the ringing stopped, all that remained were ruins and silence. But it was not an empty silence. It was a silence that breathed, like the pause between 2 heartbeats. Centuries passed. The world forgot their names, as history forgets everything that doesn't shout. But a few traces remain. A song, still hummed by shepherds on cold nights. 3 nights the bell called the dark to prayer. 3 days the earth counted as fair. A line scrawled in a monk's notebook. A bell rang under stone for 3 days. The hill bent its knee, and on the slope where the monastery once stood, the olive trees still lean slightly east, as if listening. Even now, travelers say that on still winter nights you can feel the hum under your feet, not a quake, not wind, just a presence, a reminder. They say it's the mountain breathing, or perhaps it's the last echo of the Night Pilgrims, the men who taught the darkness to keep its own watch. So, if you ever find yourself alone and the silence feels too heavy, remember this: there are those who kept vigil for you, who learned to love the dark so that you could rest in the light. The bell does not ring anymore, but it does not need to. It has already taught the earth what it needed to know. Sleep now, the watch is kept.